Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is the last session between the end of the day and going to happy hour, so don't want to be holding everyone back too long. But it's an exciting session. I think we'll have a good time and just have fun. Like I told my panelists here that my life, I live my life just having fun. So I'm Peter Muhoro. I'm with Pedernales Electric Cooperative, headquartered in Johnson City, Texas, just about an hour from here. And I can officially say welcome to Austin, because we do cover parts of Austin as well. This session is on discussing the open source smart grid, and I think what you see here is a combination of great individuals who have a lot of experience. They haven't lost my hair like I did, but good folks. And next to me is Phil, and let me make sure I say your name right, Phil Powell. He's with Dominion, and Phil currently oversees the grid innovations for Dominion Voltage, as well as he's with the Alternate Energy Solutions Group at Dominion. To his left is Scott Henneberry is with Schneider Electric, and he is the VP of Smart Grid and Strategy. Sure I get it right. Gary Hyde next to him with Landis+Gyr, and Gary is the Senior VP of Systems and Service Sales, and overseeing a bunch of different things with Schneider, with Landis+Gyr. And finally, as you have two competitors next to each other, so it's kind of a setup. And lastly, good friend Raiford Smith with a utility that's local as well, CPS Energy, and he's the VP of Corporate Development and Planning. And what I wanted to do is just have each one of them introduce themselves and their role, and then talk about what you see about the open source smart grid. And we know one of the things that is so common is that the electric grid in the US was one of the greatest innovations of the 20th century. And now we're in the 21st century where we're seeing a lot of changes as we see the smart grid. So if you could give your thoughts on the open source smart grid, where we've come from your perspective, and where you see we're going.
Just to kind of kick this off, I'd like to do a little bit of understanding of what we're talking about with open source, because there's a lot of ways to interpret that. One extreme is to actually talk about open source as shareware, where you're creating free software that you place out in a public site that's usable by everyone. Being someone who makes their living off developing software, I don't really like that particular idea. That being able to use software and build the momentum to build software that can quickly serve the smart grid market is a very important thing. And to encourage that with development and resources and the types of R&D that's necessary to keep that going is a very important part of it. Open source being operability or interoperability between devices, I'm a very strong believer in. And I think in this case, what we're really talking about is more the interoperability part of the software than we are open source and freeware type areas. Primarily because we have to keep the security parts of that software in very good control, and we have to be able to apply it in the same SIP environment and NIST environment that we've been doing before. Now, if you haven't noticed, I am in the development side of software. I have recently worked with a product that integrates DMS controls with AMI measurements to create a voltage control type application. And just a quick note on that, that was very straightforward to do because the interoperability standards were in place at the time we started doing the development. Things like DMP3 protocols to talk to devices were already there. Being able to interact with DMS environments through the standard IEC protocols and IEEE protocols that we have that were set up already. Having SIP type of cybersecurity was in place before we started building this, so we just had to build it so it fit within that guideline. And there was already the standards starting to form in NIST around and with the DOE on the AMI side that allowed us to pull that data and combine it together. Now, the last thing that I would emphasize on this is what worries me a little bit is we're now talking about stepping to the next level, not just to the front end of the entrance where we've got an AMI meter. Now we're talking about the Internet of Things, and there's a whole different area that does not yet have full standardization built around it. That is where I would say the main emphasis really needs to be to afford us a good way to proceed forward with these smart grid applications.
So to start off with, I agree completely that we are entirely in support of open standards, but not necessarily open source, right, is a good way to say it. So Scott Henneberry, I'm responsible for the smart grid strategy, not the smart grid and strategy. But anything at Schneider Electric involving the smart grid, what our internal practices are, communications, even external communications, et cetera, that's what I'm responsible for. And as a solution provider across the world to utilities, from my perspective, there are a couple things that I would like to talk about, I guess, during this 45 minutes. And one of those involves the support for open standards. But I would particularly like to note that it is almost counterproductive to have so many open standards that it's not possible to implement them all. You're therefore sort of choosing which to implement and which not, depending upon what the market requires in different regions, which inherently means that things aren't interoperable if you haven't chosen the same open standards to implement on any given device or any given software. So that's one real challenge as a solution provider that we have to understand. And the second one, again from that perspective, is the requirements that are now being put into place, appropriately I think, but nonetheless, the requirements that we now have to implement for cybersecurity issues are, and it's not obvious from the outside, but they are extremely onerous from a design, development, audit perspective, from a reporting perspective, from a responding, you know, whether you're notified that you have a breach or whether you're actually hacked. And the regulatory requirements are different not only in every state but in every country, and so the issues that solution providers like us have to deal with when we're approaching that is really tremendous. So those are the two areas I think from my perspective I can bring to the table.
Hi, I'm Gary High with Landis+Gyr, and I'm responsible for all of our sales and marketing activities as well as what we refer to as commercial operations, which gets into areas like this for us from a strategy standpoint. This is probably going to be a bit of a love fest up here just from the standpoint that the notion of standards and interoperability in industry is really what we need to get to the next level, and you know, the challenge is really how do we get there. I'm not going to try to duplicate what you two did a great job of framing for us as far as discussion topics, but I completely agree, and I think the challenge is really how do we go from where we are today to the next level, if you will, and that really looking at other industries, that's when those industries broke free and were really able to make substantial gains. And I think a number of speakers over the course of the day have made the same point. We're at an inflection point in the industry, and really the challenge is how do we do it. And while we may not have the biggest attendance here, this may be the most important topic that's going to be covered at the session or in the industry going forward. And we really, I think our challenge is to find ways that work within the industry in order to implement the things that you guys noted.
And good afternoon. My name is Raiford Smith. I'm Vice President of Corporate Development and Planning at CPS Energy. And my group is responsible for our smart grid and grid modernization activities, as well as our analytics and planning functions and our products and services that we offer. And I jokingly refer to it as Change Management Central, because so much of what we're doing is really finding ways to transform our company from the way it has done business to the way it should do business going forward. What we see and why we harp on things like interoperability is primarily because what our customers want is they want to hook up stuff that traditionally scares us. Things like photovoltaics, microgrids, battery storage. How do we do this in a way that is both cost effective as well as responsive to the customer? What gives them what they want? And the way to do that is really to focus on interoperability. Not just interoperability at a physical connectivity level, nor at a telecommunications level, but interoperability logically at the applications layer. And so much of what we have is we have systems and solutions that are predicated on a view of the world that's based on a silo. I'm responsible for metering, so I get a metering solution. I'm responsible for DA, so I have a solution that involves in distribution. Frankly, all of these things should work together to really form an efficient solution. And so much of what they've been done is they've been designed to do one thing. So much of what I focus on in interoperability, certainly standards are important, certainly they affect our operations and whatnot, but really is how do we break the silo? How do we change our thinking from traditionally looking at our business, at our applications, at our data from one perspective, and think of it across our universe in terms of how it can be used in many different ways, and how do we make it easy? Easy for our customers, easy for us internally, easy for us to use. If we can do that, if we can overcome this problem of interoperability using standards-based solutions, not only when we get the benefits of the operational side and the financial side, we'll also be able to transform ourselves as a utility and really be able to be providing services, I think, well into the future and relevant to our customers. Without that relevancy, without really focusing on interoperability, I'm not sure going over the long haul how relevant we will be if we don't fix this particular issue.
Well, thanks, Raiford, and I'll have to pick on you a little bit just because you hit on what I really think as well, and maybe it's because we're utility guys, and maybe also because we wear the same kind of hat where every day I'm looking at essentially change of things that we still have the mandate to keep the lights on as a utility. So there's certain things that you still have to keep doing, but there's also the situation of we see a lot of things that are new, and we have our customers who want to interconnect certain things, and we have technology. We've had legacy systems that have functioned a certain way. A good example, if you operated on Windows XP and all your software on Windows XP, and it's no longer supported now, how do you begin? So I think you touched on a few things. I wonder from your perspective, and then I'd like to hear the rest of you all, but I think you could get us off on going with this, is how do you view the change as we look at the interoperability part of it, and as we look at, I like what you said, a standards-based solution, because I think there's so many components of this, and standards is one of it that could really begin to provide the solution, but there's this higher level that we need to think of the logic behind it and how we'll approach this. How would you view it from the utility, and then I'll let the rest of the panelists kind of.
Sure. So I think the first problem we have is I've seen the enemy, and the enemy is us. And so much of it really goes back to our silos. Most utility employees have spent 20 to 30 plus years in one portion of our business, primarily doing one or a few set of functions. That naturally breeds excellence in that one area, but a very myopic view. And that myopic view breeds essentially the solutions that we buy, which is to say, hey, I've been in metering my entire life. Guess what I want? I want a meter. And what do I want it to do? Billing. Why? Because that's how we've always done it. And I think our biggest problem isn't necessarily the technology, though there's some great initiatives going on with SGIP and the Open Field Message Bus to federate data and do that using open standard-based solutions at the edge of networks, which should give us all sorts of new capabilities, new security functionality, and new opportunities for our customers. Our biggest challenge is us, our own people, our own way that we view the business and how we evolve. And so much of that goes with how we actually run our own careers. Sadly, I have been in the industry for 25 years, and I think I've had over 20 jobs. That has given me a certain sense of breadth, but it also makes me, I think, a bit of a challenge or a pain to some of my cohorts who really wish I would just stay in one part of the business. And I think what we need to do is holistically look at solutions rather than focus myopically on the instant problem. And I think that's the solution that gets us more towards interoperability. It gets us more towards better solutions. And it really gets us to more value.
Yeah, in response to the same thing, and understand the desire to have the interoperability standards laid out for us as an essential step in this. One suggestion is have worked a little bit with the New York REV process, which a lot of us are kind of keeping tabs on. And
Do you mind just,
yeah,
maybe
just
for
a
the
little bit of
audience to let them
background.
know what the New York Rev is?
The New York REV is really a program that's been initiated by the New York State Corporation Commission to basically deal with issues that came out of some of the reliability from the latest hurricane and the damage on being able to put a more reliable distributed system in place in New York in case there is an additional storm. A lot of it's centered, though, around looking at microgrids and distributed generation, the same topics that we're talking about here in our smart grid, but with a holistic purpose. And their initiative was they went out and actually went to vendors, to utilities, to everyone and brought them in and tried to form a good framework. It was interesting sitting inside that process. One of the people supplying a voltage optimization program to the process, along with other competitors as well. But it became very apparent that IEEE sitting beside us in their standardization development had built many of the frameworks that New York wanted to use. And there was a migration process that pulled those inside. Now, one of the unique things that got developed as a part of that process was this expectation from the Commission that there would be a distribution service platform provider. And the best way I can describe that process is a combination of your distribution operations center and an RTO that runs market and control systems for the smart grid. I'd urge you, if you're looking at what standards need to be wrapped around and where the interoperability issues may come from, that's a very good platform to start looking at. And they've done some preliminary work. I really applaud them for stepping out in front of this ahead of time and kind of giving us a good point to start from.
So I guess from my perspective, again, as a solution provider, I'd like to give you a little bit of maybe history and talk about where we are today. So it used to be 25, 30 years ago that competitive advantage as a supplier was in many cases gotten through proprietary architectures and protocols and communications. And so the advantage was if you had, because it's not in the utility world, I won't upset anyone, a building management system that was of a certain brand. You couldn't use any of the individual components unless they were that brand, right? And so it was proprietary and they locked everyone out. And now as an industry, we've moved away from that, and we went through a time, for example, some of the IEC protocols and to a degree IEC 61850 even still today, where there are agreed upon public parts of the protocol which say if you create a device that incorporates this type of information, it must be in this particular format so that that device can talk to any software over any sort of architecture. But there were also hidden pieces so that you could still have a competitive advantage, so that those hidden pieces would only be accessible by the manufacturer and his software, et cetera. And we're really, I think, beyond that today, and we're developing solutions which are which add value in terms of their real functionality. So the high-level software, being able to talk to anyone's devices, can implement some very clever, neat, voltage balancing algorithms or whatever. So that's kind of where we are today, but we have to be backwards compatible too. I mean, all of these solutions have to be able to adopt everything not only that we've done, but that a whole lot of our competitors have done too. So this is not something that's going to be fast and quick and easy. It's something that's going to have to evolve over a long period of time.
I'd just add one comment, picking up on what Raiford said about kind of the siloed nature of the industry. And yes, we're siloed within utilities, and that presents a challenge, but we're really also siloed at the regulatory level. And you mentioned New York Rev, and they're doing some very interesting things. SGIP, you mentioned, which is another fantastic group, but somehow as an industry, we're going to have to coalesce around something and make that the thing, or else we're going to continue to be siloed for a very long time. And there, like you say, there are a number of great standards and interoperability protocols that can be implemented and can achieve, a tremendous level of success, but we've all got to find the method to get to an agreement that allows it to be implemented so that then you know, the vendors like us can then build on top of that and build, you know, better, more innovative and more successful
Which
applications.
is very difficult in the regulatory environment that we exist in.
It's
California
very
is not doing the same thing that New York is,
Right,
right?
exactly.
And so,
Yeah, in fact, if you think about it, I mean, this may not be a perfect example, but you know, if you think about a standard, almost quasi-standard that's been adopted in the industry, came out of Texas, and it was Zigbee. And how did that happen? Well, that happened because the legislature wrote language that ultimately ended up being adopted. I guess the commission wrote language that ultimately ended up being adopted. And so all of a sudden you've got 7 million meters with Zigbee on it in Texas, and everybody else is buying meters going, well, I guess got to get Zigbee on it. It's not a great way for standards to occur, but we do have to have something that ultimately ends up in a framework that we can all move forward with.
Well, and I think this brings a very good point. If you spend a day at a control center at a utility, for example, and you think of how many different components are connected into the distribution grid, for example, it creates a lot of challenges. I happen to be a physicist and I get overwhelmed. Engineers probably could deal with it a little bit better, but I happen to be a physicist. And so one of the questions that I wanted us to maybe think about, and as we think of standards-based solutions, when we see all these 50,000, 100,000 different components that will somehow need to be interconnected into this thing, and the communications piece of it will really have to flow in the right way, I think one of the critical things is we're in a time and a place where we see a lot more strict rules on things like cybersecurity, and data protection and all those different, and customer protection. How do you see it, and especially for folks like Landis+Gyr and Schneider, and I want you guys to dig into this a little bit deeper as well as you feel, and then maybe Raiford can give like an overview, and myself from the utility side of it. But as we see more and more of all these interconnected pieces, as we see the utility model moving more towards a customer-centric perspective, where now we actually, as utilities, care to talk to our consumers about this is what you're spending on your electric bill. How do you begin to see all this? What pathway do we need to start? How do we begin to take the pathway towards where we could head in the future? I mean, I think there's a lot of questions. New York Rev has started to figure out how to, but overall, because there's all this, everyone is speaking their own languages. In fact, we could get down to co-ops and munis and IOUs tend to sometimes speak 3 different languages. So what will be the solution, and how do we begin to create and get us all into coming into a place where we can come up with the pathway forward?
I'll tackle that a little bit just because I can be brief, and then I'll leave it to somebody else to be pontificate longer about it. But it's, you know, SGIP is a good example. I think, you know, what we as vendors want to see is the utilities, munis, co-ops, all coming together and coalescing. The vendors are going to do exactly what the utilities contract us to do. I mean, in an odd way, this industry has basically outsourced R&D to the vendor community, with a few exceptions. Utilities don't have research departments. I mean, you know, Phil, you might be a little bit the exception at Dominion. I know Duke had some things, but for the most part, utilities don't have that skill set.
And if they do, they tend to be the one place that gets cut the budget.
No, well, I was about to say, and then they have one person who goes and attends all the standards bodies meetings, which really doesn't give a whole lot of weight to the process. So from the vendor community, I think what we need to see is that consolidated view and agreement at the utility level, kind of with the utilities out of the room, with the vendors out of the room, and then we have a way to go forward. And I think that's part of what the SGIP type organizations, I'm using that one because Sharon's here, I can use others, but you know, or IEEE or EPRI, I mean, there's other organizations that can do that, but I think that's the coalition that has to come together in order to make something meaningful happen, and it's going to be difficult because it's such a siloed industry.
and so the way I'd respond to that is that the status quo today in terms of interoperability from a solution systems provider perspective is not, if you build it according to this document, it's going to work and everything's going to be perfect. We're not there, and we're not going to be there for quite some time. Not the least of which is a non-technical reason of liability. It has nothing to do with technically whether it does or not. It is that the system provider is responsible for everything on the system. And so what interoperability means today is more of a certified functionality. So just because someone says that they are operating within a certain architecture or via a certain protocol, that's not good enough for me to say, then they can use it on my system and everything will be fine. So system providers have to test and certify and essentially stamp that, yes, this device is acceptable and you can use it on my system and I will be liable for the whole system operating the way it's supposed to. We are not, and I think we're a long way away from ever being at the true plug and play.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, the way, I'm sure your contracts are written from utilities. Utilities are risk averse. They expect, service level agreements on the products and services and systems that are provided. And we're going to build, we're going to deliver to those expectations. And that's got to, I don't want to say it's got to change. We've got to be able to do that within a different framework in order to be successful.
And it's not just the customers who are driving that, right? It's also the regulatory bodies.
Absolutely.
Cybersecurity, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, is an enormous reporting requirement now and liability. If it's going to happen one day that there's a major breach on the U.S. electrical grid because of some cyber attack somewhere. Just like at the Super Bowl. Remember when the Super Bowl was down? And the very first thought I had when I saw that is, I pray to God that wasn't a piece of Schneider gear. So we're all going to have to be very, very careful with what we claim for interoperability and not as we go forward.
Yeah, from my standpoint, as the group has pointed out, I'm a little bit schizophrenic in this particular conversation because about 35 years in utility, regulated business, in the silos, and then the last part of my career has been working with what is effectively a subsidiary of utility developing products for utility businesses. One of the benefits that gives you in seeing is you hear a lot of our perceptions being that the thing that is controlling this is the utility mindset. And I'm not so sure, being in a utility, that's really the mindset you need to be concerned about. If I go to Germany and look at what actually happened in Germany with the smart grid and the deployment of PV, it was a legislative dictate to do in-feed tariffs and switched on by the legislature, independent of the utilities, to make that happen. And all of a sudden, PV was deployed irrespective of any standards that were put out there, independent of the utility. So if you look back through the utility, what you should be seeing is a utility, a commission who can turn on and off the ability to pay for items anytime that they don't see it in the need of the people who are paying for it, and a customer who sits there that if there's not a good support for a particular program, that customer has come into the commission and had those programs stopped. So it's really more complicated than just changing the internal part of the utility itself. Now with that said, looking at how we need to go forward, there's a little bit of a fear in my mind that if we move directly now, build the standards and the structures to make the smart grid occur, we may overt the same thing that happened in Germany and Australia, where the public came in and executed what they wanted independently without the knowledge base that we just talked about in here for standards and other things. And that can undermine some of the reliability that we've worked so hard to take place within the utility. Those are really, it's not an option to go forward, because I'm more fearful if we don't move forward, the public will move forward for us.
So from my perspective from the utility, I have this fond saying of mine, which is you're either at the table or you're on the menu. And if you don't listen to your customers and serve them what they want, someone else will. So I always believe strongly that I've got to give them what they want. It may not be what I like. It may not be something that I think is even a good idea. They want it. They're right. I give it to them. That being said, when I was a kid, my dad was an attorney, and he used to tell me, son, you don't ever want to be an attorney. And so I grew up with this natural affinity to not want to practice law, and I thought attorneys were bad. Sure enough, after a few years in the industry, I decided to go back to law school and become an attorney. And the reason why was so much of this argument, which is to say, I started out my career in a very technical area of our industry, and I loved it. I thought it was great. And I realized that the attorney was telling me what I could and couldn't do. And so my rationale for losing my immortal soul was to go back and not be told, or at least to have a good rational argument to debate them, to figure out what's the right thing to do. Because the stroke of the pen is certainly mightier than the electron. And so much of what we think we can do in our grid can be completely undone rather quickly. That being said, though, I think that's the point, which is, if that is true, which we've seen ample examples that it is, much of what we need to focus on is really the architecture and not so much the end widget. And that's not to say that the end widget isn't important. It's just that you've got to get the architecture right to enable any sort of thing that the customer or your regulator may want you to have tomorrow that you didn't think of today. To some degree, this is the curse of the use case. I've written a beautiful use case. I have defined the parameters of my problem like a good engineer. And sure enough, tomorrow, it's gone. It's been broken, it's been changed. And how do I avoid that? I really focus on interoperability. I really focus on standards. I really focus on making an architecture that can handle flexibility in use cases rather than trying to build the perfect use case. And that's, I think, so much of what we as an industry need to be doing is focusing on how do I make my infrastructure flexible? Logically, physically, from a telecommunications standpoint, how do I make all of this work? Because there's always the next cyber attack that then forces me to implement something different. There is an issue that pops up in Germany that then the regulator in my state gets a great idea that wants to make me go implement. There's some net metering tariff, right? Yeah. All of these things, we've seen it countless times. We have to focus on architecture and interoperability to overcome the problem rather than, I'll just go spend some more money and buy the next best widget, because guess what? That widget's going to break, and it's going to be wrong tomorrow, not because the vendor delivered it wrong or I spec'd it wrong, but because everything around it changed. And that's the key thing, is deal with change. Deal it by focusing on architecture.
And I think, Raiford, you bring up a good point, and you all just geared towards where I wanted to shift the conversation to, is really thinking regulatory concerns. And it is true, the stroke of the pen tends to be more powerful than that electron. And I happened to spend some time in Washington, D.C., and so got to really see what that looks like. And of course, then coming to Texas and Texas legislature, I'll leave it at that for my fellow Texans here. But there's a lot of challenges as we look at the regulatory bodies, as we look at co-ops and munis governed by their boards and their city councils, and I use the PUC here in Texas. It varies as we see across the nation. Where do you see we could help to move the policy side of it? I think we do understand that the customer is going to come up with, we want this, and if we're not at the table, it's so true that if you're not, I think Peter Drucker said it right, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So you can have these great ideas, but if you don't change how you approach them, you'll never really get to implement any of them. So where do you see as an industry us helping the regulatory side of it to shift towards where we can see the future of this going?
So from my perspective,
and I should say, I also thought I'd be an attorney at one point, but I haven't sold my soul yet. So.
Don't worry, it's easy to do.
I'm still young enough, so who knows? It might happen.
Yeah. It happens gradually. So from my perspective, I think how to get over the regulatory barriers. I think the first thing is that so much of the regulatory paradigm in many states is really not carrot or stick, but stick. And, it's that, if you do a good job and you get lots of benefits, great, I'm taking that away for the customers. You should have a rate decrease. And, oh, by the way, if you do a bad idea, I'm going to take that away because you should have known better and done better. It's almost a got you if you win and got you if you lose. And I think they mean well, I really do. I think they're trying to protect the consumer and they're trying to do the right things. But the problem is what this creates is a risk-averse culture within utilities and therefore a risk-averse culture for what we ask for from our vendors, which then encourages the same, honestly, not so good service that we could really do a lot better at. The technology is there. It's not a technology problem. We can make the systems do so much more than they are doing today. The problem is how our culture, how our environment has been set up and regulated. And that's not to knock any particular groups. It's just kind of the fact of the situation. That being said, where I've seen it be successful is to give utilities not a little carrot, but to give them a significant carrot to go do things, to think outside the box, to take risks, to innovate. One of the greatest examples we've seen about this is your smartphone. And basically, telecommunications companies that were the old AT&T and Ma Bell, they were all a wires business, and they thought the crappy coverage that you would get and the lousy cell service that you would have, nobody would ever want that, right? Everybody wanted the pin drop in front of the AT&T phone, and isn't this great? Look how high quality it is. You wouldn't want that mobile phone. What did everybody do? We all want a mobile phone. Why? Well, one of the reasons why that was enabled or allowed to occur was they changed the regulations. They basically said, oh, well, that stuff's so crazy. Nobody really wants it. You guys, you'll have light regulation. Go be something over here. You're just a distraction to big old AT&T over here. And what did they do? Well, they out-innovated everybody, and they gave the consumer what they really wanted. They wanted mobility. They wanted flexibility. They wanted data. They wanted capabilities they didn't have today. They didn't want to be fixed to a landline. We in our industry have so long said affordable, reliable, and I question that saying because so much of what I see from consumers is not necessarily affordable. Photovoltaics, battery storage. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It means the paradigm from the consumer has changed. And then our regulatory bodies need to change with that. We as utilities need to change with that, and the technology needs to flow from that.
I think I just echo the same thing. I think, the challenge is communicating with the regulators because they don't sit in their seats very long. They tend to, have about a 3-year life, and they do not tend to have deep utility knowledge and understanding, and they come at it from a understandably political perspective often, and how we get that body of regulators to move either collectively or individually even is really the industry challenge. I personally have no good recommendation other than I guess we all need to go to NARUC every fall and spring and lobby them directly, but because that's what it takes, because it takes the will, but it also takes the funding mechanisms, and in many ways they're the ones that control whether it's a stick or a carrot.
From a solution provider perspective, I guess, but there is a little bit of good news. On a global basis, it's quite clear that it's no longer an anti-IEC world. There's a lot of convergence now, and and OpenADR is a good example of this, right? It started up in California. It's the law in California, I guess, and it's now spread through the U.S. to Europe and even to China being adopted. So there is some good news there. But then the question from a solution provider perspective about the regulatory issues, we care about that not so much because we want to lobby it and influence it in a certain way, but because we need to be able to see the future for what solutions we have to provide. And to do that, I think we best serve the industry through a role of education, trying just to understand what some of the issues are. I mean, 100% green power sounds really good if you don't really understand what it's going to take to get there. So we do quite a bit of education and trying to help get up to speed.
Yeah, there's some basic constructs around the regulatory model that are on a kind of a collision course with this particular technology. And I use the example, and I hope I don't bother anybody by using the 99.999% reliability, which is a very good measurement and is a good feedback for the utilities like Dominion and others who perform at those levels for it. But that 99.999 doesn't mean anything to the customer who just had 2-day outage, when averaged with all the other customers comes out to still be 99.999. The outliers in the reliability tend to be what the regulatory bodies spend their major time on. It's not the average group that's out there. And they're very focused on those, pushing those outliers back within a cost basis and a reliability basis. Their cost structures are set very much the same way. On the cost side, the issue is really non-socialization. Almost every regulator, if you bring a new program in, the first questions they begin to ask is that helping one part of your constituents or is it helping all of them? And if it's only one, how are you making sure that only that one pays for it? And usually what happens, if it's only a small portion of their regulatory body, that program has a very difficult time surviving in many cases, especially if it's a group that is not very vocal to the legislature and the commissions on that part of it. You turn around and look at the other side, the same example, the cell phone. I will tell you that my options, which I'm going to have to execute because my cell phone got lost, to pick a new cell phone, I've got 100 different options. And I love every one of those. As a consumer today, I want my options to be laid out for me. And we're hearing exactly that from utility customers. So those two constructs of reliability for the average and choices to keep socialization from occurring are two that are huge barriers to me that have to be dealt with in the regulatory process.
Well, I think, and just for the audience, I'm going to ask one more question, but I want to open up to you all. I think there are mics passing around, so would like to encourage some questions from you all. But I think you all touched on something, and Raiford began on it, we tend to say the affordable, reliable. I think it might be like in my DNA at this point. I just can wake up and it's the first thing that I say. Okay, hopefully not. But we say that a lot, and yet I take the example of the iPhone. When the iPhone 6 came out, it doubled in price. Guess what? I have two iPhone 6s, one personal and one for work. I'm not Hillary, just, since we went there with it this morning. But as a customer, I chose to pay, even though I realized it was costlier. I wonder from both our perspective as a utility, one of the things we're constantly doing is working to keep the rates as low as we can. And yet at the same time, we have the pressures from our customers saying we want X, Y, and Z, which in reality costs money. So how do we address that battle, both from, I think, the utility side of it, as well as from you all as solution providers? How do we look at addressing that battle to make sure that we meet? Because at the end of the day, the customer is going to be the one who is going to demand something, and we have to provide something as a utility for the customer. So how would, any words on how we would approach that battle? And it's a constant one that we're constantly thinking about every single day.
So not to put my economist hat on, but Bonbright would tell you in traditional rate-making theory that there are two ways to price your product as a utility. The first is a cost-based solution, which is largely what we've adopted as an industry. The second is a value-based solution, which is to say it's worth what it is to you individually, and that's what you'll pay. Much of the rest of the free market world works on value, right? That Apple iPhone, its cost basis is very different from what the actual sticker tag is. Yeah. And I'm not necessarily proposing that I go to the retirees and the people on life support or whatever and say, how much would you pay for my electricity? That's what I'll charge you. But on the other hand, beyond kind of a base service, whatever that base service may be, there are value-added capabilities that I should be able to add on, and I should be able to charge not a cost-based price, a value-based price. And really that gives me as the utility the incentive, the financial motivation, and perhaps the regulatory paradigm to provide new capabilities that my customers want and that my customers demand. If I don't get that capability, I'll tell you, we'll probably as an industry take a very risk-averse, very cautious, very slow approach to adopting technology and capabilities. I would argue, let's open it up. Let's find those ways to differentiate the base service from the value add and tack on that regulatory paradigm to it so that I can then go back to the vendors and say, guys, here's what I really want for that additional service, because it provides me an enormous value that I'm willing to pay for, I'm willing to do a lot for, because that helps my customer.
Any other thoughts from you?
Yeah, from our perspective, I think the way to drive that, and the way we are trying to drive it, is where we can, i.e. the deregulated areas, right? Working with the utilities and the retailers as a partner, sometimes a white label, sometimes, you know, just going together to customers, but as a partner to try and bring as much innovation and as much new product and service as we can to those customers.
Yeah, from a standpoint, you heard what the perception of the regulatory side is and what my utility basis says. To me, the vendor basis side of this is very simple. It's for you who are my direct customers, you who write the checks for the product that I'm producing, I'm going to listen to you. I mean, it's very simple in our part. If someone is convinced they need this application, I'm going to cater the development of that application to the person who's going to pay for that part of it. So I'm going to listen to that as a vendor.
Are there any questions from the audience? I think that's Bob King. And I think, I don't know, I'm not sure if there's a mic.
I don't need it. You can hear me pretty good. And Raiford, I'll tell you what, I will help you get the right to sell whatever you want if you'll let me compete with you.
Perfect. So, I would point on that point, so many people, when they hear me say that, if they're a utility employee, think, oh my God, what is this guy saying? But the point is you're exactly to your point, which is, frankly, if I ought to be able to earn that kind of a return, I ought to be competitive for it. Because frankly, if I'm not, that's how we got regulation that got us the cost-based model that we're in today. So I agree with you.
So actually, I was going to throw back something else about everybody that was talking about the regulatory world. And everybody complains about the legislature and regulators. But the fact is, they are never going to know as much about your business as you do. And they respond to, in fact, you mentioned the PUC wrote Zigbee into it. Well, that wasn't actually them leading that. They're looking around going, well, what do you guys want to do? And we all put our heads together and said, well, let's go with Zigbee. That looks like the way we're going to go. And so we really, I'm a lobbyist. Part of what I do is regulatory person. So I'm going to tell you, you guys, it goes back to you again. You've got to get your act together and say what you need. Now, I heard you say we need the utilities to require us. Well, how far along is SGIP? Is that the thing that came out of this, by the way, the whole effort that spun off into so many groups? I know it's a huge thing to get your hands around, but if the industry really could come forward with something that they would like to impose, regulators would do it. I mean, public officials will do things for public purpose. You just simply have to define it in terms of what is the public purpose. But the problem is if you two agreed on it and went in and we tried to pass legislation, everybody else in the industry shows up and says, oh, wait a minute. That same legislator says, come back when you can agree. Because I don't know, I can't tell what needs to happen, right? So it's again, it comes back and you have to have a critical mass of agreement amongst yourselves on it. So I throw the problem back at you.
And I think that's it, right? That because you've got SGIP, and unless we get SGIP or whatever the next body is that's able to coalesce both utilities and vendors and present something as a common viewpoint, we're going to stay in the same place that we're at. And you're right, on the Zigbee thing, that was kind of pulled out of a hat by a vendor who happened to be more aggressive about their positioning than most, I would say, most vendors tend to be in the space. They choose not to go lobby directly. You get your hand slapped by the utilities.
So,
hey, I paid your bills, so.
So I think one point on that, so when I was at Duke, I created what I call the Coalition of the Willing, which perhaps was better named the Coalition of the Kicking and Screaming. And what I did was I went out and I solicited 60 different solution providers and said, what I'd like you to do is build to a common standard that is standards-based, it's accepted by OASIS, it's not a utility thing, but here's the architecture I'd like you to build to, and I want to demonstrate, a use case, a solution at Distributech and show that this is possible and it can be done very easily and simply. We did it, we got 6 6 vendors. We did demonstrate at Distributech. It was very successful. Duke now has 27 in their coalition and growing. At CPS Energy, one of the reasons why I left Duke was so that I could continue that work and do it at another utility. And so now I'm at CPS Energy, and we are doing the exact same thing. I never put initially a lot of faith in the standards bodies because, one, they take too much time, and they really incessant quibbling over what I believe is minutia that really misses the strategic point of how do we make our systems work together. And so I avoided them, and I have avoided them for quite some time, but I've finally been sucked into them, only because it's now time to evolve beyond 6 cajoled vendors into 27 more willing and interested ones, and really make this a standard that people can point to and build to and certify product against. And honestly, what I don't want it to be is Zigbee, where a vendor is saying, here's my thing, go make my stuff the standard. So we also patented it, and we then promptly turned around and gave the patent to SGIP and IEEE because we said none of you will own it. And that's the whole point. You're not going to profit off the architecture. The architecture is the enabling capability that enables the interoperability. Build that, and then your products will have far more value to me. But that's how we, at least at Duke and now at CPS Energy, how we're tackling that problem is to build willing coalitions, vendors, utilities, others, to build not only the standards but the product itself that creates interoperability and more value.
Yeah, the gentleman from Schneider, you mentioned open standards, but not necessarily open source. Would you please elaborate on that?
Well, we participate in all of the standards bodies, and we build solutions around those standards, like IEC 61850 or the DMP, any of the others. What I don't think that is necessarily a good idea in our types of solutions are to be publishing the source code, making that source code available, and letting other people modify it and take it back. I think there's, for reasons of security, for reasons of competitiveness, I just don't think it's a good business model to proceed. So that's what I mean.
At what layer of open are you concerned about here? Like the control center layer, you don't want to open source Game Master, or are you talking about like in the embedded systems you don't want Linux?
I don't think that we have an issue with some of the embedded systems, and I think we use some embedded systems somewhere. I certainly would agree that we wouldn't open source some of the SCADA master type software, et cetera. But we don't make those embedded systems ourselves, right? We're a customer of those embedded systems. So, from my perspective, I would want the intellectual property that we're developing and we're responsible for from a liability and a security perspective to remain with us.
So, sorry, one quick point on that one. So as a utility that buys stuff, I agree there are definitely some security concerns about them, but I do think companies like Red Hat and others that are kind of working and being successful in the open source space doesn't imply that those things don't have value. And just to be clear, I think there are great ways to develop and innovate and create new things. There's always got to be a commercial version, something that somebody stands behind that we can point to, because I've got to have legal responsibility and I'm going to point legal responsibility. We've all kind of got that issue. But it is a great tool for innovation, and it is a great tool for evolving where we are. So I don't want to make it sound like as a group that we are thinking that it's a bad thing per se. I think it actually has some great benefits. It's just they have their limitations too.
Many of you have mentioned cyber attacks, and Raiford, a question for you is, many people might be surprised that you hired the chief of police. Are there specific breaches that you were concerned about in doing so?
Yeah, so the following statement is not meant to be a pejorative one about my past. But so there I was, a lowly intern as a call center unionized clerk at Savannah Electric and Power Company 25 or so years ago. And I was bored, and I decided that I would hack our Novell network. Why? Because it was there. And I was just curious about computers, which might explain my ultimate major in college. And so I created a little program that hacked it, and hacked it repeatedly. And every time I would hack it, I don't know why, but I would impersonate the vice president of marketing and a guy named Mike McClure, long since retired. And I would send people various messages about how smart I was, which is really a stupid thing to do. One, because it announces that you've hacked their system. and two, because it gets you in trouble with IT security. I think the problem with security itself is a lot like the solutions that we've had. A lot of times it's very siloed. And one of the interesting things I think about our hire of Bill McManus, who's our former chief of police in San Antonio, is he's not a cybersecurity guy. And frankly, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's a great thing. Because the cybersecurity guys are going, man, you know what I want? I want a correlation engine that's going to look at log files, and I want to do these sorts of things. And well, that same correlation engine could really be helpful when you're thinking about diagnosing grid issues and telecommunications issues. It's just pulling in data and looking for correlations. And gosh, frankly, looking across all three of those data sets might be helpful to diagnose what the problem is rapidly. But so much of what we look at is that myopic solution. And Bill's one of those kind of guys, and with his background, he doesn't have a deep depth in cybersecurity, and he's not a deep utility guy. Perfect. Right? Because he's going to look at the problem and go, hey, what's the best way for me to solve it? And frankly, I think that kind of fresh look is actually a much needed thing in our industry, and I'm glad we brought him on, because that's the sort of problem. It's not the problem I can get, right? We all know about Stuxnet and all the other potential hacks that are out there. What we don't know about is the next hack. And frankly, that's the kind of security I'm worried about. How do I make my network, I know it's going to be penetrated, I know it's going to be attacked, how do I limit the damage? And really that's the area that I think we're focused on as a company, to get ahead of the problem as opposed to always looking backwards at what it was.
I think when I got into the utility industry, someone told me of the name dumb old utility guys. And I kind of asked why, and it's just because you do the same thing that you've been doing over and over again, and you just don't really change. And I think you're very right about the utility industry. One of the things that we have to do is find those who could take the step back and look at it from a holistic perspective and say, what are really the challenges that we need to deal with, and how do we address this? So, and I think that was one of the greatest moves CPS did. Take one more question if there's one from the audience. Well, I don't want to keep you guys too long, but I do have one question for you all, and maybe you could answer it and give like a quick closing statement. But as we look in the utility industry, one of the things that we see, and I know it's not necessarily related to this topic, but we have a dying age. The workforce is dying. You don't have as many young people as coming into this. We see a lot of challenges in getting those, and you get 3 system planners leaving, and you're trying to get 1 hired at the same time because everything is changing. And so you're running into areas of lack of expertise and all these things. How do you all see how we could address this issue of getting more people in the utility industry, both from the utility side of it as well as vendors side of it, of getting those who could come in and not just, and really have a whole different perspective? Essentially the Facebook generation, how do you get them into what we've had as a legacy system? In a word, innovate. That's it.
This is an interesting challenge. So as a company, we've been going through a bit of a hiring spurt and trying to go to, we're based in Atlanta, so Georgia Tech and some other good engineering schools, and get students interested in coming to Landis+Gyr. And we had some challenges because we were kind of viewed as a utility-centric organization. When we changed our positioning to be much more about green and technology and innovation, we have no problem recruiting very creative, young, enthusiastic people to the organization, because we've presented them with a problem, basically, the problem we've been discussing, which is the foundation of the economy. Come work on that, and that gets them excited.
So our message to utilities in this particular area is keep what is absolutely strategic in-house, but outsource the rest. As an example, no one is better than Schneider Electric at end-user energy efficiency. And so and this is a message that we send to utilities, to the extent that you want to become good at end-user energy efficiency for whatever reason, work with us to get there. Don't try and develop it internally.
From a utility standpoint, our major initiative in this area is really directly working with some of our local colleges with their power programs. And what we've been pushing is really backing off of some of the power specialties. What we've seen in the past is very, and it's almost the same silos that we've been talking about. very focused development of power engineers coming out of college with particular backgrounds. And today, we've got to send them a very clear message that it has to come with the other package of communications knowledge behind it, development and hardware development and actual application knowledge that goes beyond the power system, so that we've got a holistic engineer who can work with the smart grid systems the same way they worked with power systems before. The requirements are different. We need to go out and tell the schools what those are and collaborate with them to build programs to do that.
Well, it's interesting. I was talking to a utility that's right next to a campus, and they serve power to the campus. And I asked the engineering manager, do you have any interns from right next door? And he said, I don't have time for it. And I realized they'll never be able to get the next generation of folks who can come in and really see the perspective of it. But I think you hit it right, is covering those things that matter to a young person today, that they, societal changes, and they want to take care of the environment and different kind of things. I think that's really where it is. With that, let's thank our panelists for a wonderful job today, and we'll close off, and I believe the instructions were given a little bit earlier. There's the event at 6 o'clock across a block and half a block from here, and thank you.